All right, welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are on episode 110. We're continuing to read High Rises by Ben Austen, and we are on page 207. In the midst of this blitz, Mr. T dropped by Cabrini Green with his signature mohawk, feather earring, and bib of gold chains. The A-Team star stepped out of a Rolls Royce, telling children that a car like that could be theirs if they studied hard enough. It was just 2 weeks before the 1992 presidential election, and Bill Clinton stumped at Daley Plaza downtown, asking supporters to help him oust President Bush, who he said would never pay for the additional cops needed to keep Chicago safe. Quote, "We owe it to Dantrel Davis," end quote, Clinton shouted to cheers. One of the more elaborate dedications to Dantrel Davis was an architectural contest held by the Chicago Tribune. The newspaper put out a call for designs of a, quote, safe, livable, end quote, Cabrini Green. It was an idea contest. The winner would not be hired to design anything, but the hope was that the result would offer a template for the actual remaking of the near North Side development. Quote, "Bricks and mortar didn't kill Dantrel Davis," end quote, wrote Blair Kamen, the paper's architecture critic. But Kamen did blame the avant-garde modernism of Tower in the Park public housing for its part in turning Cabrini Green into an island of poverty. Quote, "Apartheid, American style," end quote, Kamen wrote, adding that these designs impose, quote, "an ideological straitjacket on the free-flowing fabric of big city life," end quote. One of the 300 entrants in the competition was a second-generation architect named Mark Amstadler, the son of Lawrence Amstadler, the original architect of the Cabrini Extension Towers. The younger Amstadler said that his father's work was held up as the embodiment of an ill-conceived, faulty design. He wanted to win the contest to liberate himself, and his father, from the trauma of his past. Another entrant proposed outfitting Cabrini with an amusement park, the Big Hell Ferris wheel. Someone else envisioned a medieval village with dramatic spires topping the high-rises. Yet another suggested connecting Cabrini to the tidal currents of Lake Michigan. But the winners all adhered to the new urbanism that was then coming into fashion, taking their cues from old-school town planning and the anti-modernism prescribed by Jane Jacobs. The winning team, a group from Fargo, North Dakota, of all places, drew up a traditional small-scale cityscape reattached to the street grid of low-rise row homes built around a neighborhood square that included commercial buildings, several schools, churches, and a daycare center. It would be an area no longer set at a remove or distinguishable from its surroundings. A half-century later, it demonstrated a return to the country's first model for public housing, the Cabrini row houses Redux. In the past, demands to knock down Cabrini Green and the rest of Chicago's high-rise public housing elicited charges of racism or shrugs of helplessness. Almost 100,000 poor black residents lived in the city's public housing, with an additional 44,000 on the CHA waiting list and 70,000 homeless. Where were public housing residents supposed to go? In the most racially divided city in America, however, Dantrel Davis created a bit of consensus. Quote, "Now is the time to start tearing down the Chicago Housing Authority high-rises," end quote, declared an editorial in the Tribune. Quote, "Now, while the memory of Dantrel Davis, shot dead at Cabrini Green on his way to grade school, still burns our civic memory," end quote. Like Ayn Rand's protagonists on The Fountainhead, those who formerly supported government housing for the poor were ready to fill the towers with TNT and be done with them. In a survey conducted by the Defender, 2/3 of the respondents thought Cabrini Green should be demolished. The city's newspaper opened up hotlines for callers to suggest solutions. Vince Lane looked to expand an experiment along the lakefront on South Side in which CHA towers have been rehabbed and filled with the 50-50 mix of public housing and market rate units. Quote, "If we could take Cabrini and turn it around without wholesale displacement of the people who live there, I think that can be a blueprint for this whole country," end quote, he announced. Gary Becker, the University of Chicago Nobel Prize-winning economist, suggested that Cabrini privatize, with the government selling the apartments to their current occupants. The CHA floated the idea of buying single-family homes in the suburbs and moving residents there. Cabrini Green did in fact need to be made safer and more livable, and maybe even replaced entirely with something better. But acting out of fear, spurred on by a moral panic, almost guaranteed that those who lived there would lose out with whatever succeeded it. Looking beyond Dantrel Davis memorials to see the underlying problems that caused the current conditions in the city's public housing, the segregated site placement and overabundance of children, the mismanagement and poor maintenance, the deficits and declining fortunes of cities, the loss of nearby jobs and the departure of work families, the gangs and drugs and the stigma, seeing any of that had become nearly impossible. Fewer and fewer Americans believed they had a collective responsibility to provide enough for those who had too little. Most serious debate about inner cities, social services, and housing subsidies gave way to tough talk of police, prisons, and demolition. The mayor of suburban Bolingbrook let it be known, just in case, that his village of 40,000 would be accepting 0 families from Cabrini Green. The December after Dantrel's death, word spread at Schiller Elementary that there wouldn't be enough donated Christmas gifts for all 325 students. In their desperation, some parents began to hoard the remaining presents. With the name Cabrini Green attached, the, quote, Grinch parents, end quote, became national news, a story of public housing dwellers so debased that they would steal Christmas itself. One of the television news anchors reported sorrowfully, quote, not even the season of giving could protect the needy from the greedy at Cabrini Green, one of the poorest and meanest of housing projects, end quote. I think one of the things that stands out to me after that passage is the stigma of survival. The people who survived the conditions of Cabrini Green, who survived the violence, who survived the police terrorism, survived the mass incarceration, the racial injustice, the miseducation, the discrimination, the people who survived through those things were stigmatized for their survival. People didn't want them to move into their neighborhood. We had seen the divestment of funds in their neighborhood. The people, news reporters in the news media and even Hollywood has come there to exploit their experiences and to stigmatize their experiences. And often that's something that you find when you are a person of color and you survive. You don't become a statistic, that you're stigmatized for that survival. Hold on, got a little noise in the headphones there. And so I think that's what stands out to me in that. Let me see. I think my batteries might be going out on me. Yep, and the battery's going out. So we're gonna end this episode, and we're not gonna end the episode. We just gonna end the segment. Several months earlier, around Easter of that year, Marion Stamps awoke from a dream. The Cabrini Green activist looked at the clock, 4 o'clock a.m., and then she began writing out the letter that had appeared to her in her sleep. She was not a churchly person. She didn't spend her Sundays in the pews. Her profane outbursts could startle even the gang members she worked with, but she did consider herself spiritual. Quote, the Lord was revealing to me what he wanted me to do, end quote, she said of the dream. That entailed hosting a 4-day feast for the Cabrini Green community, a unity festival, breaking bread with the, quote, street organizations, end quote, which is how she referred to the gangs. The letter she copied out was a plea not just to them, but also to everyone at Cabrini Green. All bore some guilt for allowing the damage to their community, herself included, even if only by resigning themselves to the appalling normalcy of gun battles and the inevitability of their collateral damage. The letter addressed first the men, quote, you say you sell drugs because you can't get a job. You brothers will do anything but stand up and be the brave black men you were born to be, end quote. Then she called out the women, quote, you should be sick and tired of being sick and tired. Sisters in the ghettos, trenches, valleys, or whatever you want to call where you live and raise your children, get raped every day for real, end quote. In the Cabrini Green divided by gang boundaries, Stamps' Tranquility Marksman was directly across the street from the 2 Cobra Stones, controlled towers and alongside white high-rises overseen by the Gangster Disciples. She insisted that her community center be a safe haven, and she regarded herself as the leader of all Cabrini Green, as well as someone who fought for the rights of poor black people throughout Chicago and the world. She signed the letter Queen Nzinga after the 17th century Angolan monarch who defeated the Portuguese in battle. Stamps was 47 in 1992 and had lived in the area for almost 30 years. That August, a week after the murder of LaQuanda Edwards, she joined Cabrini residents as they marched from their home to City Hall. Quote, "The residents are entitled to protection and security as United States citizens," end quote, a coalition of Cabrini Green tenants wrote in a statement they delivered to the mayor's office. The group pointed out that guns and drugs were transported easily through the development, that police didn't patrol the buildings, and that vacant apartments and abandoned floors were never sealed off. Quote, "The citizens of Cabrini Green have exhausted all options at their disposal regarding this frightening situation and have come to you for effective leadership and firm action," end quote. In September, Stamps hosted her annual Labor Day block party in front of her center, an event that she held for 22 consecutive years. It included games for children, burgers, ice cream, and music. Stamps talked about her letter and the need for residents to take responsibility for ending the violence. At the fields across the street, the J.P. Morgan U's defeated the first Chicago near North Kikuas to win the Cabrini Green Little League Championship. Then, a month later, Dantrel Davis was killed. It was a tragedy that could hardly be called a surprise, and Stamps was less shocked than enraged. She was someone who normally used her tirade strategically. She fired off broadsides to disrupt meetings or attract the media or to announce that she would not be bullied, not by the Dailies or Charles Schweibel or Jane Byrne or anyone. But there was nothing tactical in her fury now. She didn't know Dantrel Davis. She never spoken to his mother, but his killing shattered her all the same. Weeping and cursing, she made her way across Division Street over to 500 West Oak Street. She needed to see the boy's family, sharing the heaviness of the loss. On her way there, she passed gang members outside their buildings, telling them she was serving notice. Quote, "Not another motherfucking baby is going to die," end quote, she barked. Quote, "Since y'all can't figure it out, I am," end quote. Quote, "What? Marion Stamps? What?" End quote. Quote, "Enough is a motherfucking enough," end quote. She sent word that she wanted to talk to the heads of the gangs. She told them to come to tranquility. The next week, just after Mayor Daley declared war on the criminal element at Cabrini Green, Stamps held a press conference of her own at Little Missionary Baptist Church beside the Marshall Field Garden Apartments. Daley had an 11-point Cabrini plan. She presented a 15-point peace plan for Cabrini. Rather than boarding up the high-rise where the rifle cartridge was found, she wanted the building repurposed to house an alternative high school, a library, a youth shelter, and a drug treatment facility. She demanded that empty apartments and other high-rises be repaired and that families who needed homes be moved into them. She asked that the local schools be fully staffed and the neighborhood stocked with a food co-op, a movie theater, a bowling alley, and an arcade. Most communities took these sort of amenities for granted. At Cabrini Green, their addition could mean the difference between life and death. Stamps pressed her first point most of all, calling on street organizations at Cabrini to, quote, "cease all negative activities, to declare a citywide truce, tell the black community you are sorry for all this pain and destruction you have caused us," end quote. Months earlier in Los Angeles, after the riots following the verdicts in the Rodney King beating, warring gangs had honored a ceasefire. If the Bloods and Crips could pull it off in Watts and South Central, then why couldn't the guys from Cabrini Green and all over Chicago do the same? Stamps was ready to ensure that a truce struck. Quote, "Before I let anybody break the peace on this near north side, they'll have to shoot me down like a dog in the street because I'm coming at them. I'm coming at them. You're not going to do it," end quote. When Wallace, quote, Gator, end quote, Bradley heard about all these calls for a ceasefire, he believed he was the one who could sell the idea on the streets. A Southsider who seldom traveled to Cabrini Green, Gator knew of Marion Stamps through her activism and admired the way she refused to back down, especially the men. Quote, "She was like a present-day Harriet Tubman," end quote, he would say. A former enforcer with the Gangster Disciples, Gator saw himself as a diplomat for peace as well. He'd grown up with Larry Hoover on the South Side, and they served time together at Stateville in the 1970s. After his release, Gator founded a public relations firm, Legator Productions, and he worked as an aide to Cook County Commissioner Jerry, quote, the Iceman, end quote, Butler, the crooner from Cabrini Green who gone into politics. In 1989, Illinois Governor James Thompson, a Republican, granted Bradley a pardon, wiping clean his record, citing his work with children, and Gator ran for alderman of the ward that included the Robert Taylor homes, losing in a runoff to the incumbent. He also continued to act as a spokesperson for Hoover, who was now leading the gang from a minimum security prison 6 hours south of Chicago. In the summer of 1992, Gator was visiting the Temple Mount in Jerusalem's Old City when he experienced an epiphany. Staring at the Wailing Wall, thinking about the divisions between Jews and Arabs, those who identified with the 6-point star and those who followed the star and crescent, Gator could suddenly see how little separated the black gangs back home. Whether you were folks or people, you spoke the same language, shared the same culture, were descended from Africans and Southerners. Upon his return to Chicago, Gator started showing guys how the 5-point star and the 6-point star could be combined into a 10-point star by virtue of adding a single letter, the letter L, for love. It was hokey, but people were killing one another over these minute distinctions. Gator needed to demonstrate that these symbols were arbitrary, immutable, that new collective identities could be formed this easily. He printed up white buttons with an image of 2 clasping hands surrounded by the logos of the city's major black gangs and the words, quote, united in peace, end quote. In response to Marion Stamps' proclamation, Hoover decreed that there would be a truce. Shorty Freeman did the same, as did the heads of the other black gangs. In their different sections of the city, Gator and Stamps and others spread the news of the peace from street corner to street corner. Any rank-and-file member who didn't honor it would be violated by his own crew. Someone who broke the treaty and was incarcerated would have to answer for his crimes behind the prison walls. Gator told young gangster disciples that he didn't want them or their mothers coming to him after the fact, begging him for another chance. There would be nothing he could do for them. At the end of October, 3 weeks after Dantrel Davis's killing, an actual treaty was signed at a ceremony held at Tranquility Marksman. The leaders of each gang, every, quote, nation, end quote, showed up with an entourage of 20 or 30 people, filling the great hall in the back of the center. The gang chiefs brought along not only their generals, but also their mothers and grandmothers, their wives, girlfriends, and children. Cousins who were in opposing gangs embraced for the first time in years. Al-Jamil Mustafa, the leader of the Mickey Cobras, read from a 5-page document challenging those assembled to prove that they were descendants not of Al Capone, but of great black kings. Although Stamps hosted the event, she spoke little that day. What she asked was that people think of Dantrel Davis and all the other children who lost their lives in the violence. At Cabrini Green, no shootings occurred in November, 0 in December. 2 days before Christmas, a 19-year-old walking with his girlfriend on Larrabee was jumped by 5 guys and beaten with bats. The crime was notable for being the first serious assault reported in 2 months. For 8 months, Cabrini Green saw just 1 shooting and no homicides. Citywide, the year-to-year homicides dipped slightly. The truce included only the black gangs, and it didn't address intra-gang violence or incidents that had nothing to do with gangs. Police reported 570 major crimes, including 2 murders at Cabrini Green in 1993, compared with 717 major crimes and 7 murders the previous year. Wanting credit for their work, Gators and others sought a meeting with the mayor, but Daley dismissed the treaty as a ruse. Quote, they sell drugs. That's not a gang truce. They sell weapons. They extort money from merchants. They threaten people. Forget about it. End quote. Why, then, were there fewer murders at Cabrini Green? Simply put, Daley said, quote, the heat was on, end quote. The police had Cabrini on lockdown. In the Tribune, the columnist Mike Royko lampooned the idea that gangs should be commended, saying it had also been a long time since he shot anyone and there were no parades in his honor. Quote, gang leaders and their social activist mouthpieces apparently believe that because they haven't killed each other for a month, they deserve special recognition, end quote, Rockford wrote. Quote, most Chicagoans endure years, decades, entire lifetimes without shooting another human being. Imagine their frustration. The average bungalow owner in his town never kills anybody. Eric Davis, the police officer known as 21, said that publicly police officials couldn't praise the gangs. But privately, his superiors instructed him and James Martin, Officer Eddie Murphy, to keep the gang troops in place as long as possible. Children were jumping rope and riding bicycles in Cabrini Green playgrounds. Students were walking to stores without scanning the upper floors of buildings for snipers. Davis and Martin helped start a baseball little league with teams from the different CHA housing projects competing against one another. No way that could have taken place before the treaty. Years later, after he'd retired from the police force, Davis would admonish himself for squandering an opportunity to change Cabrini Green in a more lasting way. They could have used a relative calm as a lure to bring in employers, job training, drug programs, GED classes. Quote, "Was it a good try?" End quote, 21 said. Quote, "Yeah, but so what? We didn't sustain it. Ultimately, it failed." End quote. Gator helped form a national peace movement with the Reverend Jesse Jackson, the Nation of Islam's Louis Farrakhan, and the head of the NAACP joining him and hundreds of other current and former gang members at summits across the country. They met in Kansas City, Cleveland, D.C., Minneapolis, and back in Chicago, insisting that the country couldn't arrest and imprison its way out of a crisis of youth violence. In January 1994, a day before Bill Clinton delivered his second State of the Union address, Gator Bradley and Jesse Jackson drove a white Cadillac to the White House to advise the president on the pressing issue of urban violence. It's unclear what the president took away from the meeting. Later that same year, Clinton signed into law the most sweeping crime bill in the nation's history, greatly accelerating what was already a 20-year trend toward mass incarceration. The crime bill funded the construction of new prisons, enshrined a raft of additional mandatory minimum sentences, and eliminated many prison education programs. The following year, federal officers in Chicago charged 39 members of the Gangster Disciples with conspiracy. Larry Hoover, charged as well after agents recorded him conducting business from prison, would be transferred to the Supermax facility in Florence, Colorado, where he joined Jeff Fort, the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, the 1993 World Trade Center bomber Ramzi Youssef, and a short list of other high-profile terrorists and organized crime bosses. All of those arrested in Chicago were reputed Disciples leaders, but with them gone, the police didn't so much rid the city of the gang as eliminate its top-down authority. Chicago gangs splintered into hundreds of cliques, smaller subgroups that warred with one another. At one of the national peace summits he led, Gator blessed the convocation, praying for the, quote, nonviolent movement, end quote, to prosper before turning to the topic of his detractors. Quote, "Father, I ask of you, all those naysayers, all those agent provocateurs, all those who will stand in the way of this peace, I ask that you bind them. I ask that you snap the limbs in their bodies and wipe them from the face of the earth. Amen." End quote. Okay. I think one of the things that is important about the passage that we just read is that throughout these 200 plus pages that we've read, one of the things that we have seen is the same way that there is an illegitimacy that comes along with the institution of policing and the criminal justice system and some of the policies and laws that were in place for the citizens of Cabrini Green, just how their life, things that they've seen in their lives reinforce the fact that these institutions are not legitimate because of their behavior. There's an element of life within Cabrini Green that is legitimate and tangible for these people that people who live outside of it don't deem to be legitimate or don't deem to be tangible, and that's the street life and the gang life and the black market when it comes to drugs being sold and guns being sold. And one of the things that we've seen is that we've seen multiple times within this book when looking for protection It's not the police that are going to by the teenagers that feel vulnerable. It's gangs that are going to, or a different gang leader that's going to, or a forming of their own clique that happens, as opposed to going to the police or as opposed to going to their older person. And then we see when there's a need for money, when somebody needed money and needed to make ends meet, we've seen that it hasn't been always going to an older person or going to fill out job applications or going, and people have, again, people were filling out, not probably, but the further back you go in time, the more difficult being a person of color it is to gain employment. And so I'm sure that people were also trying to gain employment, but besides combined with the fact that they were people of color, people in poor working class communities, living in public housing, and then on top of those things, going and filling out job applications was going to make it more difficult for them to attain livable wages. And so it's not a surprise that they would turn to selling weed or selling crack or selling drugs when that's something that has been legitimized and has been an option that they've seen their entire lives growing up. And what needed to be part of a precedent that had to take place, the same way that they legitimized the desire for self-determination that the people within public housing had by giving them in the one building the option of managing the building themselves and organizing and mobilizing the people in the building themselves. You have to also understand that just because you don't like gangs or you don't like people selling drugs or you disagree with it ideologically, it is something that exists. It's something that has existed for an extended amount of time, and that when you are trying to deal with the issues that are in an area, you can't pick and choose the issues that you deem to be legitimate to be dealt with. And we see the mistake being made by the mayor of the city not sitting down and having a conversation with the gang leaders and not legitimizing the fact that it was good that there was a decrease in violence from the gang members because of the fact that, whether you like it or not, there are certain elements in our society that exist. And if you want to alter those elements and change those elements, you don't do it by ignoring that the elements exist and then behind the scenes trying to change those things. You give credence to the fact that they exist, and then you openly and transparently work to change some of those things. And the same thing with Mary. We also see within here that it takes people with courage to not only stand up to the things that are dangerous to the black community outside of the black community, but also to speak about the things that are dangerous from within the black community. I never will say that an individual should not be culpable or responsible or accountable for an individual action that they make. I just also on top of that individual being highlighted for their individual wrongs, we have to also look past to the societal wrongs and the institutional wrongs that continues to create the opportunity for individuals to make these decisions. It's just as much as it's important to hold somebody who does a mass shooting or who murders somebody or who robs somebody. This is important as it is to hold them responsible and hold them accountable in a just, humane way. It's also important to hold the institutions in the parts of our society that leads to mass shootings, that leads to people feeling like they need to rob or to get things. Why we have to address those things as well. Why those things exist as well. We have to take the time to look into the root causes as much as we look into the effects. And I'm trying to think. I was trying to get to something with there. Oh, and so I was saying all that to say that. So it is still important. We see with Marion Stamps that she does criticize the parts of the city and the parts of the white power structure that led to these issues existing. But within criticizing those, she also takes the time to point out the fact that she's tired of the gang shootings that's going on in Cabrini Green, and that she wants it to be a stop to those things that's happening within the community as well. Let me see. Let me see how long we got. Okay, we almost done with this chapter, so we'll finish this chapter up and then we'll end this episode. In the months and years that followed her son's death, Annette Friedman alternated between thoughts of retaliation and of the stupefying fact that Danny was gone and she'd failed to protect him. She blamed everyone, though most of all herself. Why hadn't she listened to him the night before when he talked about his fears of dying? Why hadn't she eased up just that once and let him stay home from school? On the 13th of every month, she had a death wish. The only man she ever loved died September 13th. Then her son, the only child she ever had, died the same day a month later. She carried a gun with her, ready to shoot. She'd see a stranger and think, "You want this? Let me show you how much hate and pain I got inside me. I can crush you." Bert Nataris, the alderman of the area that included Cabrini Green, had clipped many of the newspaper stories about Dantrel Davis. He sent them in a carefully arranged packet to Annette. Quote, "I write to let you know that we, in government, have not or will we ever forget your son, Dantrel." End quote. He helped pass the resolution in the city council to rename a stretch of Cleveland Avenue outside Jenner School, just feet from the shooting, Dantrel Davis Way. Annette attended the dedication ceremony, along with Jesse White and other politicians and city luminaries. She was later given a replica of the Dantrel Davis Way sign, but she stored it in a car she was living out of. And when the car was towed, she lost it and her other belongings. People told Annette they would help her with a job, an apartment, a book about Dantrel's life. She never saw any of it. And no one ever suggested counseling. No one helped her cool her overheated mind. At one point, she was arrested on a weapons charge and served a year in prison. She needed a gun, she felt, since no one else was out there protecting her. In prison, though, she was able to reflect on her purpose in life. She knew she could take the easy way out and become a drug addict, a killer, a prostitute. She could go and commit suicide because she lost everything. But she needed to represent her son in a better way. She didn't want to bring down his name. She was the mother of Dantrel Davis. She would do better. Annette sometimes visited Danny's street sign at Cabrini. She liked that 60 years from now, or in 160 years, no matter how much the neighborhood changed, someone walking over there would look up and say, quote, "Hey, we're on Dantrel Davis Way," end quote. She came to believe that his death had happened for a reason. That was why he had smiled at her that morning and said he was doing something. Everything led up to that moment. He was sacrificing his life for others. A citywide truce lasted for 2 years. Many young people who might have been killed were spared. The gangs kept it going because of Danny. And if God gave his only begotten son, who was she to ask questions? That was her comfort. She had to look at it that way. He died to save others. Dantrel Davis changed Chicago forever. And then that is the end of part 2. And that brings us to part 3, rotations on the land. Man, this has been just like many. I don't think we've read a single book that hasn't honestly been heavy, and had different sections and segments that were heavy. And I think that chapter in particular was very heavy. So we're going to end this episode there. I would encourage people to listen to previous episodes of Rockford Reading Daily if they haven't before. And if you listen to this and it's new episodes out, please listen to those other episodes of Rockford Reading Daily. We're about 2/3 of the way through High Risers by Ben Austen. And then I think after that, we'll be reading Freedom is a Constant Struggle by Angela Y. Davis. And that's a shorter read. All right, we outside.